So what happens when you're pulled over and investigated for DUI? A lot of different things could happen, but you need to understand what is most likely to happen. In many circumstances where you're being pulled over and investigated for DUI, or you're stopped at a police roadblock and they ask you to provide a sample into a roadside breathalyzer, that's usually the first step of DUI investigations. Now, the police are allowed to skip this step, and they're allowed to go right to asking you to provide a sample into the bigger instrument at the police station, but in most cases, they're going to ask you to provide a sample into a roadside breathalyzer, and you should know it's a criminal offense to refuse to comply with that demand, so you must provide the sample into the roadside breathalyzer in Canada. Don't listen to US legal information that tells you that you can refuse the breath test, because that does not apply in Canada, and it is a criminal offense and the consequences are severe. Once you provide the sample into the roadside breathalyzer, if the sample says fail, it doesn't give a numerical reading, it just says fail. If you're over 0.08, then you're going to be arrested, you're going to be read your rights. You do not have the right to contact a lawyer until after the roadside breathalyzer test is administered. Once you're arrested, then you have the right to contact a lawyer, and the police will ask you if you'd like to speak to a lawyer. It doesn't matter if you don't have any money, it doesn't matter if you don't know any lawyers, you can still ask to speak to a lawyer. Police officers have to make reasonable efforts to put you in touch with a lawyer, and there's also a free 24-hour toll-free legal aid duty counsel service available across Canada to give you legal advice in the event that you're arrested for DUI or for any other criminal offense. And police officers are required to provide you with the phone number or make the call and put you in touch with one of those lawyers. If you don't want to talk to a legal aid lawyer and you want to talk to a specific lawyer, you have the right to pick a lawyer of your choosing. And if you don't know the name of a lawyer, then you're entitled to be given a phone book or a list of lawyers or some type of a mechanism to look up a lawyer in order to find a lawyer's information, to contact a lawyer to obtain the advice that you need. So you can feel free to say a specific lawyer if you know one, you can feel free to ask for a phone book or some type of a directory, or you can ask to speak to legal aid. And it's always a good idea to talk to a lawyer in these types of cases because there's a lot of information specific to the location where you're arrested that you might need to know. Once you're arrested, you're usually going to be taken back to the police station, sometimes to a breathalyzer bus if the police are using them. They don't use them in a lot of places in Canada, but if they do, to a breathalyzer bus, at which point you're going to have to provide samples into the breathalyzer instrument. The big instrument is the instrument that they use to prove what your blood alcohol level was in court. If you do the roadside breathalyzer test, that test is not admissible as evidence against you in court, but the big breathalyzer, not the roadside one, is. And the big breathalyzer is also mandatory. If the police officer demands that you do it, it is a criminal offense to refuse to comply. So sometimes you're going to be providing up to 3 different breath samples in a criminal impaired driving investigation. Once you provide those breath samples, usually you're going to be free to go. It's very rare in Canada that people are detained overnight after providing breath samples, but when you're at the police station, you're going to provide usually a minimum of 2 breath samples into the big instrument. And those 2 samples are governed by a specific set of rules set out in the criminal code. So they have to be taken a minimum of 15 minutes apart. They have to agree within 20 milligrams of alcohol and 100 milliliters of blood of each other. The instrument has to be operated according to all sorts of different procedures and requirements. So if those conditions are not met, then you may be required to provide more samples, and you're required to provide as many samples as are necessary in the opinion of the person operating the instrument to enable a proper analysis to be made to determine the concentration of alcohol in your system. So that means that you actually have to provide sometimes, in some cases, 3 or 4 breath samples into the instrument at the police station in order to get accurate readings. Obviously, any of those, refusing to do any of those could lead to an additional criminal charge. And if you provide 1 or 2 and they don't necessarily agree, and then you refuse to do more, you could actually end up facing 3 charges for being over the limit, and they can get an expert to interpret the readings, for being impaired, and a 3rd charge for refusing. So it's definitely not in your interest to refuse. The samples often are also taken after what is known as an observation period, which is typically a 15-minute waiting period prior to taking the first sample, and then again between the 2 samples, to ensure that you don't do anything that can interfere with the results. As we've talked about before on this channel, your breath test results can be affected by things like burping, belching, vomiting, regurgitation, anything taken by mouth that contains alcohol or that can interfere with your mouth temperature. And so police are supposed to watch you, literally watch you, for 15 minutes before you provide the sample, and they're required to ensure that there's none of these intervening factors that can elevate the test results. But case law in Canada has determined that there doesn't actually have to be the 15 minutes before the first sample. Now, it's police training to do it, but there are no legal remedies if they don't do the 15 minutes before the first sample unless there's actually something that could have interfered with the test. So if you are arrested for DUI, the important things that you need to take away: you must provide any breath or blood samples that you're requested to provide. 2, ask to speak to a lawyer as soon as it's offered to you, and make sure that you ask for whatever lawyer you want. And 3, don't worry. You're probably going to go home that night. You'll be sleeping in your own bed. You're not going to spend the night in jail.